Okay, so welcome to Plot and Blocking. This is a talk about how to use promise, progress, and payoffs to get out of a storytelling slump. Sometimes telling a story can feel like exploring uncharted territory and not knowing where you're going. Or maybe you've charted a path, but it just doesn't feel right. What you thought was your North Star just seems flat. And with stories, the journey is just as important as the destination. There are many ways to tell a story and many ways to get to where you want in a way that feels satisfying. Looking at promise, progress, and payoffs will help you identify where problems are and give you a starting point whenever something feels off. I'll also share workflow tools I use and strategies from other writers and directors at the end, if there's time. So I'm Jackie, and here are 6 of the visual novels I worked on in 2023, either as a writer or director. All of them are complete stories fully written by me, except for This Magical Girl's a Bitch, which I am co-writing. I also work full-time in the game industry as a narrative designer. I'm really honored to be here, and I was inspired to make this talk because of Sejbo, who I invited here today. She sent me a very sweet message asking how I seem to churn out stories and how, as someone newer to the visual novel scene, I got so good at game writing. Now, I've struggled deeply with storytelling. When I was little, all my teachers told me I should be a writer when I grow up because I knew a lot of words and wrote beautiful descriptions, but I still didn't know how to tell a story. One day, we had a science test where we had to tell a story about a piece of food moving through the digestive system, and I thought it was my time to shine. So I was writing the most hilarious, beautiful, poignant prose about a piece of gum being chewed. But at the end of 30 minutes, time was up and the gum didn't even go down the esophagus. My teacher felt bad for me, gave me a retest, and then I did the same thing again. So for anyone feeling stuck, it may feel like you run into the same problems over and over. I certainly did, and here are some concepts and strategies I learned that helped me actually build out a story. First off is promise. It's what your audience expects. There's the promise from the branding, title, and visuals of a game, whether that's in tone or genre. But more importantly, promises in the opening scenes of a story. A lot of people would rather be creative and not do something super expected or cliche, but understanding promises is still crucial to figuring out your plot, even if there's a twist to it. There's already lots of examples of media taking an established idea and genre and twisting it. This Magical Girl's a Bitch is an obvious example where the hook is that it's in a magical girl genre, but she's a different kind of magical girl who isn't the nicest. One of my favorite examples is Monsters Inc., which puts a twist on the monster in the closet as someone just doing their job and the kids as the ones that are scary. And in Doki Doki Literature Club, you learn it's not such a sweet and innocent story, but one that breaks the fourth wall of established visual novel sims, dating sims. Generally, you want to drop clues that there will be twists either immediately or as the story progresses, because it wouldn't feel satisfying if you reveal something near the end that was never hinted or referenced at all, because that's not what the audience who stayed would have expected or put together. Promises are fun to subvert, but there's various ways to do it, and sometimes it can come off wrong and give the wrong impression. For instance, Tiny Creatures is a very entertaining and high production story that got a 38% on Rotten Tomatoes. And why is that? If a story is good, shouldn't the audience like it? Well, if you're marketing yourself as a nature documentary and you're really doing something that feels more like Keeping Up with the Kardashians in creatures form and is very dramatic, there's just a gap of expectations, and that may lead to a low rating. But this also depends on context. Another example is Haunting in Venice. It got pretty good ratings, but like, for instance, I had a friend who watched it and thought it was very boring and not what he expected at all. I think that may be because it was premiered and shown during Halloween, and it was shown to seem like a paranormal horror movie. And people who are familiar with this detective would know this is actually a mystery and there's a logical explanation for everything. So, for example, in Spooktober games, if a story seems very cozy and cute, but it has really scary monsters, that's a twist that might be more welcome than if something seems like it'll be really scary, but then it's not at all and only revealed at the end and there's not really spooks, for instance. Now, next up is progress. Progress is the invisible string that pulls your story forward and makes your audience want to know what happens next. It's what follows after a promise is made. What progress looks like is different depending on the promises of a genre. For example, in a romance, progress can look like your character getting to know the love interest, whether they are getting closer or getting annoyed at them, and this allows the plot to progress. But in a horror or a high action story, your audience might be bored if it's just about the people getting to know each other and not the horror elements or action that they came and expected. They wouldn't see this as progress, but as filler. And this is different for the expectations of every genre. Progress is measured by how your character changes and responds to challenges. Depending on your genre, there can be internal and external progress your character experiences. I'll use Pilla's Paradise, the first visual novel I directed, as an example. Pilla is an established streamer from the future, and that is a key part of her identity. This is her character promise, and she sees herself as a popular streamer who's eager to show off her creativity. This part of her identity and promise is deeply connected to her problem and her stakes. When her numbers are dropping and her manager wants her to stick to the script, which she finds boring, this leads to conflict between them. Then he threatens to cut her off, and because of this, Pilla is motivated to regain her popularity by visiting the trendy last paradise on Earth. Her promise, problem, and motive sets up the premise for the story, and her character development continues to be linked to her streamer identity, how she streams, what she does it for, and seeing the world for what it is outside of streaming, as well as using her platform. And finally, payoffs. This can refer to endings, but it's also what your promises and progress leads up to. Based on the events of your story, these endings and payoffs feel earned because of everything the character went through and the choices they made. It didn't just happen overnight. I got permission from Signy, one of the directors I wrote for, to share the endings of Marigold's Mannequin and share how it's a thematic payoff. Now, Marigold's Mannequin starts with Mary putting on bold clothing on her mannequin and commenting how she'd never had the guts to do that. And the theme throughout is that Mary doesn't truly live for herself in the way she really wants. And throughout the story, Mary is not taking steps to improve her life, while Goldie, her mannequin, is. And as I saw this premise and outline, I could see how the themes would go well with the motif of a mannequin, something literally lifeless without any choices, and how that could relate to trying to be someone else. In one of the endings, there is a fight where Mary gets so tired and frustrated, she threatens Goldie with a steak knife. And one of the endings, if she lets go and gives up the fight, she suddenly goes slack and the knife impales her instead. And then she slowly becomes a mannequin that Goldie ends up taking care of. And Mary is just happy not making any choices. So this choice of ending would relate to the overall themes of the story and add up to a payoff based on everything that was built up before it. You can also use promises to troubleshoot your plot if you're ever overscoped or just meandering. For example, in Boy Band Hell, which I created for the Yaoi Jam, my idea behind it was inspired by the first time I visited Wattpad. I saw how many stories there were about real people getting shipped, and I wondered, how must that feel? So Boy Band Hell asked the question, how would it feel to be in your formative years, growing up and getting public scrutiny over your sexuality, even getting shipped with a crewmate of yours? It's a psychological thriller about a boy band reunion gone wrong, showing the dark side of public obsession and how some superfans push the limits in these parasocial relationships. In my original outline, I had a scene where every character's secrets get revealed, and it's a way of getting them to listen to the superfans who are bribing them. But midway through drafting it, I realized I'm over half the word count and I'm not halfway through the story yet, probably a common issue. So when I started to look at what to cut, I looked at what the key theme is. And even though I had intricate backstories for every boy band member, I realized the overall theme is not about everyone's dark secrets. So instead, I implied and hinted at what those secrets are that players can theorize about, but honed in on Connor, the main character's secret, which is related to these themes. As an analogy, you can think of the way you're writing progress and the level of detail you're describing it with as the types of shots you set up. How much of it is actually needed to move the story forward? What are the important details you need and what don't you need? A common beginner mistake is just doing extreme close-ups on everything, like a zoomed-in surveillance camera that leaves no detail untouched. So you can think, in a movie, how often do you see extreme close-ups? And how difficult would it be to tell an entire narrative that way? You want to vary your shots and the level of detail in which you describe things to actually get your point across. Now let's look at planning and progress. I talked to two other writers and directors about their process to inform this part. Now, whether you're an outliner or not, you want to have an idea of what the most important parts of your character's journey is. For a more mysterious story, that could mean knowing when reveals are shown. For a romance, that would mean bonding moments. And for a dark fantasy, that can mean the trials that your character faces. You can even borrow narrative structures from existing work that will complement the story you want to tell. Now, let's say you know your main plot points. What now? What do you put between them? Brackets are little promises, progress, and payoffs that you can put between your main plot points. Basically, you can give your character little goals or challenges that emphasizes or contrasts the overall theme and raise the stakes. You can use different conflict types to achieve this, and conflicts don't always have to be super serious. A common one is interpersonal conflict. For example, Pilla had a conflict with her manager because she wants to do her own thing. This leads to her manager cutting her off if she doesn't raise her numbers. Interpersonal conflicts are a great way to compare different motives and points of views and how they line up with your theme. Another common conflict is internal conflict. As your characters set along their path, they may have self-doubts, get pushed outside their moral comfort zone, or even question their own identity. There's also societal conflict. For example, in Pilla's Paradise, that meant encountering other streamers who is bothering a local and seem to look down on Pilla. Pilla also finds out that a significant portion of her audience is just there to make fun of her, and their comments were previously blocked by mods in her augmented reality life site. There can be overlap between different conflict types too, such as technological conflict. Pilla learns that she was genetically engineered to stream, and there's lots of Pilla clones out there doing the exact same thing. This ties into society and her own creative identity, and of course, interpersonal conflict because her manager was aware and works with many Pillas and just doesn't care. Now, not all conflicts and brackets have to be serious. For example, after an intense rising action, you might want to slow down a bit, give your audience time to recover. In Pilla's Paradise, an example is environmental conflict. Pilla is not used to being on an island in nature and getting cut off from having her bodysuit and things that make everything comfortable for her. So there's a cute little bracket where it rains and she kind of freaks out. But Vinako, a local she befriended, is just enjoying it and ends up taking her to a mushroom cave where they have a music jam session together. Then he has his own internal conflict there. Anyways, the goal is to have challenges for your characters to respond to and think about what internal and external factors affect them as they grow and develop in relationship with your theme. Now, a truly satisfying ending should feel like a treat. All the parts should fit together, like a mystery being resolved from clues throughout. There's a quote I love from Aristotle where he says, endings should feel surprising and inevitable at the same time. Now, I just love that. It shouldn't be so obvious that your audience would have guessed it, but also shouldn't feel like it came out of nowhere and you didn't set it up. I'm a sucker for a good ending, and I'd love to see more attention on this. A common comment I get often is on the endings of my stories, and it's something I really enjoy writing. I love seeing how people respond and what resonated as well. And if you're not sure, you can think about what you want to say. If you ever feel stuck, this is a good thing to brown back on. Sometimes you might start with a clear idea and theme, or other times you may need to find it after you start writing. A theme is a recurring idea, like an ambience or aesthetic that follows your character's growth. So what is the takeaway? How do you want your audience to respond? Of course, people will have their own interpretations, but for instance, in Marigold's Mannequin, the motif about agency and life choices really resonated with people who played it, and pretty much every comment we received was about how relatable it felt. So when you really put attention on a theme, it is noticed. And cutting board. This relates to when I was preparing for this presentation. I practiced 4 times and got feedback and cut a lot and restructured a lot of slides. Making time for feedback is key because you can understand your own plot better and how it feels to someone experiencing it for the first time. A fresh perspective always helps, and sometimes you need to kill your babies to make it fit within the scope of your project. And another question I got is how to deal with writer's block. If you ever get writer's block, it is usually because of one of two things: motivation or oversaturation. Motivation is related to discipline. When you're a new writer or energy levels, you might not want to write or you just don't have a writing practice. And some things to do to resolve that is maybe list what inspires you, set a timer and just fill an empty page. Try using a notebook, experiment with different genres and kind of find your flow. And also, most importantly, give yourself permission to write badly. Even though I was sharing how to structure a plot, it's okay if you don't have everything figured out. And on the flip side, if you are oversaturated, you've written a lot and you feel stuck, it might be time to touch grass and take a break. Taking time away will allow you to see your story more clearly in terms of promises, progress, and payoffs. It may also give you new perspectives to bring in. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I can also share a bit about my workflow as well. So I really enjoy using Notion because the toggles make it very easy to put ideas you may not want to include after you're fleshing everything out, and then you can easily open them and rearrange them and clean up your doc. I also use Figma sometimes to map out paths. I talked to some other directors too who use, one of them is a free writer who doesn't work from a written outline, but she does take inspiration from existing narrative structures and other stories and describes her process as outlining in her head. She takes notes from films, books, and other stories and sensory motifs and structures. And she asks herself questions as she writes about how the character feels, how they're affected by what's happening, which is another way of tapping into promises, progress, and payoffs, even without outlining. Another is a meticulous planner that uses Scrivener to move around stickies and plan out choices. And in terms of writing under other directors, I would say working with Signy, she had a very clear outline and it was very simple with just me and her. She clearly showed the premise and themes and scene breakdowns throughout, which made it very easy to go in and add suggestions. And I'll share all the links when the YouTube video comes out so it can be included. She gave permission to share it as well. All right. I think I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, I got a couple of questions here. So first one, how much do you consider comeuppance when planning the path to a satisfying ending?
I don't know if I think about it that way. Any clarification on that? Comeuppance
like getting their just like the bad character getting their what they deserve.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I guess this is just my perspective, but I think I tend to like get feedback from others who are like, you should give your characters more comeuppance because it seems like they're getting away with things. So usually when I start, I think about more like getting away from those kinds of people than giving people revenge. But when I get feedback on that, then I'll think about ways to create like a way to punish those bad characters more. For me, it's more about the hero's growth and kind of rising above all of the bad things, like kind of rising above the haters rather than getting back to the haters. But I do have some endings where it is definitely about revenge. So it kind of varies, but yeah, that's my take on it.
All right. And another question is, do you weigh tropes and subgenre when you're planning your promise, progress, payoff?
I think I'm not sure if I think of tropes in particular. I do look at established ideas. For example, with Pilla's Paradise, I thought about like the tourism industry and how you can go to a very beautiful paradise and it feels like sometimes the tourists are not respecting the place. So it kind of built off of that. I'm not sure if that's a trope per se, but it's totally valid to go on like TV tropes and like look through that and think of your own twist on it. I don't know if like I consciously think of tropes, but I think that is a good way to think about it and consider how you can be different from those tropes or what you want to emulate.
Cool. All right. Now here's one. How do you figure out a theme when you created the story and characters without giving any thought to having a theme?
Oh, I often don't think of a theme in the beginning. I might just think of a sensory motif or like for instance, I'm working on the queer vampire visual novel jam, and I just thought of like a vampiric angel, and I started from there. So sometimes you can just start writing and see what themes start to emerge and like build on those. So you don't have to start with a theme in mind, but as you're writing, you can think about like, okay, but what is this really saying? Like, I'm still finishing up the script for that one, but I was thinking about what it means to be an angel or what it means to be holy and high above and have that kind of power. And when, people down below may not be having the same empowering experience that you are. So I started to think about that, but it's not like forced in or anything. It just kind of emerged.
Cool. All right. Well, last question here is, how does being a narrative designer work? Is that like writing outlines and working with the writers filling in, or is it a mix of the two?
With narrative design, it's about writing everything, including what the player experiences. So that includes what do they see in the world? What kind of sounds do they hear? Like instead of just a written word, it's also thinking about the entire experience that a player has. So there is writing involved, but there's also considering other elements of the experience. I actually had some slides on narrative design that I don't know if I'd have time, but like for instance, in Pilla's Paradise, there's a mini game where there's lots of annoying pop-up effects and comments to show how fast-paced her digital experience is. And then later she has a meditation experience where she's just breathing in and out and pressing up and down as the interaction to kind of contrast that. So that's an example of narrative design.
Mhm.
Another is I have like lots of bonus slides, but another is the use of a social battery in Carrot's Our Cinderella project, where you have to use up your social battery to text people, and later that's part of the narrative. So I found that really interesting too.
Okay. And someone asked, like, do you take up like a pseudo QA role to make sure that the end result matches the vision that you laid out?
Yeah, I definitely play test all of my games and I get play testers as well. Um, yeah, I would say like testing, rewriting, rereading, checking those things out is an important part of the process.
Cool. And guess what? That brings us to the end of VNConf.